After being falsely accused of a terrible crime that shook Little Sedona in Arizona, a man was abandoned by his family and lynched in the street. Because of this, he began to live in a wheelchair. It was only after his death that his innocence was proven. At that moment, the children decided to enter his house that was closed. When they entered, they saw the letter that their father left them. They cried emotionally and never forgave themselves for what they did. Robert lived a quiet life in his hometown, Little Sedona in Arizona, a picturesque place where everyone knew each other. He was a middle-aged, stocky man with hands calloused from hard work over the years. Her brown eyes conveyed an innate gentleness, and her smile was a reflection of the peace she felt in her heart. Fulfilled with the life he led, he had married Mary 30 years ago, a kind and dedicated woman. Together they had 3 children, David, Luca, and Anne. David, the eldest, who had always stood out for responsibility. Luca, the middle one, was the free spirit of the family, while Anne, the youngest, was joy personified. The life of the family was centered on simple and solid values. Robert worked as a carpenter. His workshop was an extension of his home, a place where he spent long hours turning raw wood into beautiful furniture. Mary took care of the home and the children with an almost sacred zeal, while the children devoted themselves to studies and games in the yard. Robert's family was known in the community for their togetherness and strong values. Their house was a haven of love and harmony, always full of laughter and conversation at the table, being all very well seen by the whole neighborhood. Sedona was a real haven of tranquility from all the chaos of the outside world. They saw on the TV news everything that was happening all over the country and were horrified, grateful to be there in that quiet place. Afternoons were marked by the sound of children playing, and evenings were brightened by conversations on the balconies. Everything seemed perfect until, one gray morning, Robert's life was turned upside down. A heinous crime has shaken the community. A young woman from a nearby neighborhood had been found dead with clear signs of abuse, and the shock quickly turned into a witch hunt. The morning the tragedy occurred began like any other. The sun was rising on the horizon, bathing the village in a golden light. After the family breakfast, of which Robert did not know that he would be one of the last with that customary piece, he was already in his workshop, hammering with precision as the wood took shape under his skillful hands. The smell of sawdust was familiar and comforting, a reminder of his passion for the craft. Suddenly a neighbor came running, his face pale and his eyes wide with horror. He brought news that froze Robert's heart. "Robert, a tragedy has happened. Adam Smith's daughter found dead. Less than a block from here, thrown into the bush, with signs of abuse," said the neighbor, almost out of breath. Robert dropped the hammer, the shock visible on his face. He blessed himself 3 times, a silent prayer to ward off the evil that seemed to have settled in his peaceful community. "Oh, my God, that's awful," exclaimed Robert, feeling a wave of sadness and disgust. How can something like this happen here? In the days that followed, the village was shaken by tragedy. Word spread quickly, and the quiet atmosphere was replaced by a cloud of fear and mistrust. Police prowling every corner looking for evidence and eyeing possible suspects. People began to look at each other with a certain distrust, and whispers became constant, trying to find a culprit for it. After lunch, after the children had retired from the kitchen, Mary called Robert to corner and told him. "Robert, you won't believe what happened this morning," Mary said, a worried expression on her face. "What is it, dear?" Robert asked, interested. "The cops showed up here. They said they found a dead girl in the neighborhood," Mary replied, looking out the window at the yard. "Yes, I know that, but what were you doing here?" They didn't give many details, but the backyard was fenced off. "It looks like they're looking for something," Mary explained, pointing to the yellow tape that demarcated the area. Robert frowned, worried. "I hope they find what they're looking for soon. It's horrible to think that something like this could happen so close to home." Mary nodded, still shaken. "Yes, I hope they find out what happened and that we can feel safe again." The conversation left both uneasy, their minds filled with unanswered questions about the tragic event. 2 days later, while Robert was immersed in his work trying to drive away dark thoughts, he received an unexpected visit. 2 policemen appeared in the workshop. Their expressions were serious. "Mr. Robert, we need you to accompany us to the police station to give a statement," said one of the officers, his voice firm but polite. "But what do I have to do with it?" Robert asked, confused and apprehensive. "Just a few routine questions, sir. It's important to the investigation," the other officer replied, gesturing for Robert to follow him. At the police station, Robert sat in a small, cold room. The fluorescent light above him cast a merciless glow, increasing the feeling of discomfort. The 2 policemen positioned themselves in front of him, with notebooks and ruthless expressions. "Mr. Robert, where were you the night the girl was found?" asked one of the policemen. "I was at home with my family," Robert replied, trying to remain calm. "We had dinner together, and then I went to the workshop to finish a project. My wife and children can confirm this." The officers exchanged glances, noting something on their pads. "Could anyone have seen you that night?" asked the other policeman, his words charged with a veiled suspicion. "Me? Dunno. I didn't leave the house. I was working late," Robert replied, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The questions continued, each more insidious than the last. Robert felt the weight of distrust growing, even without understanding why. He had nothing to hide, but the pressure of questions and the oppressive environment were beginning to undermine his confidence. When Robert returned home, Maria was waiting for him, her face a mask of worry. "What happened, Robert?" she asked, hugging him as soon as he entered. "I was called to testify about the girl's case," he replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They asked a lot of questions, Maria. They're looking for a culprit." "But this is nonsense," exclaimed Maria indignantly. "They know you're innocent." "I know, but it sounds like they're desperate to find someone to blame," Robert said, feeling a chill run down his spine. The following weeks were a torment for the family. The police had found blood marks in Robert's yard, a clear sign that something had happened there, although they could not yet point to the culprit, but this was the closest they had come to finding something or someone. In this way, with everything still very foggy, the gazes of the neighbors became more and more hostile, and the whispers louder. Robert felt like a stranger in his own home, an innocent man caught in a web of unjust suspicion. Without concrete evidence, but with immense social pressure, Robert was charged. Rumors spread like wildfire on dry straw, fueled by prejudice and misinformation. Robert's family was in shock. Mary couldn't believe what was happening. On a night of despair, she confronted Robert in the kitchen of the house, the place where they had so often shared moments of happiness. "Robert, tell me that's not true," she begged, her eyes filled with tears. "Mary, what are you saying? Even you? I swear on our children's lives that I am innocent," he answered, his voice trembling with the pain of unjust accusation. "You know I never leave here." But Robert's words were not enough to allay the fears of the community. Social and economic pressure on the family became unbearable. Friends and neighbors, who once treated them with affection, now avoided them or cast reproachful glances. The children, feeling the weight of stigma, began to move away from their own father, each finding a different way to cope with the pain as they were being excluded by their peers at school. With all that turmoil and upheaval in their lives, the situation was becoming untenable. Mary already suffered the reprisals in the neighborhood that said she was covering for her husband, and because of this, she became disheveled and walked around the corners of the house, dragging herself while crying hidden. While Robert tried to stay focused on his work, but due to all that, the orders had closed, and Robert spent most of the day walking inside the workshop itself, thinking about all that calamitous situation. Confronted by her own inner demons that Mary one night finally confronts Robert with, she is terrified of the whole thing and says they need to move out and start a new life, expressing her desire to leave the tragedy-scarred place behind. Robert, in turn, firmly replies that he cannot agree to this, since it would be like admitting guilt or accepting the accusations hanging over them. He believes facing the situation is the only way to clear their names and move on. "Mary, we can't just run away. That would be like admitting we are guilty," Robert said, with a mixture of determination and anguish in his voice. "But Robert, people have moved away from us. Our children are suffering. I am suffering. At this rate, soon we will not even have anything to eat. No one wants to order something for you. We need to face this together. You're with me on this, aren't you?" There was a moment of tense silence as Mary seemed to ponder her words. She didn't respond immediately, leaving a weight in the air that Robert felt deeply. "Mary?" he asked again, seeking a confirmation of his support. Mary's silent response made Robert even more uneasy. He knew the situation was serious, and Mary's uncertainty worried him deeply. The need for support and unity in the face of difficult circumstances was clear, but Mary's unspoken words hung like a cloud over them. Devastated by all this, Robert spent 2 long days in silence, thinking about what to do, when he finally decided that he really should leave town. But, to his misfortune, when he goes to the police, he is told that he cannot leave the city during the process. He returns home and shares the news with Mary, explaining the delicate situation they find themselves in. "Mary, I went to the police today," Robert began in a grave tone. "They said that I am under investigation, and while this lasts, I cannot leave the city." Mary listened in silence, absorbing the gravity of Robert's words. She looked at him with concern, understanding the complexity of the situation in which they were involved. "So what are we going to do now?" Mary asked, seeking direction amid the uncertainty. Robert sighed, feeling the weight of circumstances on his shoulders. He held Mary's hands firmly, trying to convey security despite the difficulties. "You must go," said Robert earnestly. "It will be better for everyone if only I stay here while this unfolds. And when everything is clear, I will find them." Mary looked into Robert's eyes, seeing the determination and concern in them. She nodded, recognizing the need to move forward in the face of the adversities they faced. "Okay," Mary replied, agreeing with his decision. "Let's go. We'll figure it out together." Robert and Mary began planning their departure, knowing they would face challenges, but confident they could overcome them together. The next morning, Mary contacts her family in Phoenix and decides it is best to move there while the investigations continue. Robert, though reluctant to part with Mary and face the situation alone, supports the decision. "It will be better for everyone I know," Robert says with eyes full of tears. On the day of parting, an emotionally charged atmosphere fills the house of Robert and Mary. Tight hugs, silent tears, and words of encouragement are shared between them and their loved ones. Robert watches with a mixture of sadness and resignation as Mary and her children board the bus heading to Phoenix. He stands outside, waving as the bus of Mary and her crying children pulls away, taking her to a new chapter in Phoenix. The feeling of loneliness begins to set in slowly, contrasting with the emotional turmoil that marked the farewell and that last hard month. Robert knows that he will have to face the challenges that lie ahead alone, while waiting for the outcome of the investigations to finally reunite with Mary and start their lives together again, wherever it may be. Alone, everything has become even more difficult, and Robert, now alone in his home, faces even more the weight of the accusations hanging over him. Each day becomes an emotional challenge as he tries to maintain his everyday life while awaiting the outcome of the investigations that he prays will be as soon as possible. It was late one afternoon, 5 days after his family left, that the setting sun cast long shadows across the empty room of Robert's house. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring fixedly at the floor, lost in thought as the weight of accusations intensified with each breath. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the monotonous ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, loud knocks on the door took him out of his reveries. Robert stood up with a mixture of anxiety and resignation. "Mr. Robert, may we come in?" A grave voice echoed from the other side of the door. He hesitated for a moment before opening. 2 policemen entered with seriousness stamped on their faces, holding thick folders with evidence. "What have you discovered?" Robert asked in a trembling voice, hoping against hope for a turn in his favor. One of the officers, Detective Ramirez, fixed his gaze on Robert before starting. "We found something new. Genetic material was found in the victim's body." "It's yours, Robert." The words fell like a blow to Robert's chest. He backed away, stunned, speechless to contest the incriminating evidence that now entangled him further. "That can't be true," Robert muttered, his voice mixing despair and denial. Ramirez folded his arms, his expression unflappable. "We need to take him for questioning. Please join us." Robert was handcuffed and felt the walls closing in around him as he struggled to process the gravity of the situation. He looked around at the house that had once been his refuge, now transformed into a nightmare scenario. The neighbors, curious with the scene, went out of the house to accompany that humiliating walk of Robert, who kept his head down, and soon the whole small town knew what was going on. The only certainty left was the shadow of the accusations that would haunt him no matter where he went. With one last look at his empty house and a heavy heart of uncertainty, Robert followed the cops out, knowing that the impending confrontation was not only with the authorities, but also with himself and the truth he still struggled to comprehend. "I didn't do it," he insisted desperately, looking into the eyes of the policeman for understanding during interrogation. Ramirez sighed heavily. "The evidence says otherwise, Robert." The detective held out his hand to Robert, a gesture that symbolized not only the need for cooperation, but also the irrevocable rupture between the past and the uncertain future that was now unfolding before him. "Let's get this over with once and for all," Ramirez said firmly, as Robert felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. That same night, Robert was held there while awaiting trial, but with that last piece of evidence, he no longer had any hope of being released. After being taken away by the police for questioning, Robert was informed that he would have a lawyer assigned to represent him in the process. Sitting in a barren room lit by fluorescent lamps, he nervously awaited the arrival of his defender. Minutes that seemed like hours passed until the door opened and a tall, imposing man entered, followed by an air of determination that filled the room. "Robert, my name is David Collins. I will be your lawyer in this matter," the man said in a firm, reassuring voice, extending his hand to greet him. Robert shook Collins's hand with gratitude, mixed with a dose of despair. "Thank you for being here, Mr. Collins. I really don't know how it all got to this point." Attorney Collins nodded understandingly as he sat down at the table across from Robert. "I understand that this is an extremely difficult time for you, but we need to focus on preparing their defense as best we can." During the hours that followed, Collins explained in detail the legal proceedings that lay ahead. The jury would soon be set, and it would be crucial for Robert to face the charges as clearly as possible. The genetic material found is significant evidence, but it is not conclusive by itself, Collins explained, choosing his words carefully. "We need to challenge the way this evidence was collected, the chain of custody, and any other procedural flaws that could be exploited in our favor." Robert listened intently, feeling a mixture of relief at having an experienced defender by his side and a sense of growing despair at the seriousness of the charges against him. "We're going to fight it, Robert," Collins said with conviction. "We will show the jury that there is more to this story than the initial evidence suggests. Do you have any alibis or witnesses who can corroborate your version of events?" Robert shook his head slowly, feeling reality weigh on his shoulders. "Me? I don't have anything solid. I was home that night with my family." Collins nodded gravely. "We will work with what we have. We need to be meticulous, strategic. Every detail can make a difference." With the jury now rapidly approaching, Robert realized there was no turning back. He would have to rely on the legal system to uncover the truth, while his life hung in the balance of justice, waiting for a verdict that could alter his fate forever. After harrowing months in jail, Robert finally faced the trial that would determine his fate. The courtroom was filled with anticipation and tension, reflecting the seriousness of the charges he faced. Sitting next to his lawyer, David Collins, Robert faced the jury with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Prosecutors presented their evidence, including genetic material found in the victim's body, seeking to incriminate him. Each testimony was like a blow that threatened his innocence, but Collins remained tireless in his defense. During cross-examination and argumentation, Collins meticulously disputed the validity of the evidence presented. He questioned the chain of custody of the genetic material, pointed out inconsistencies in the testimony of key witnesses, and highlighted gaps in the investigation that could lead to erroneous conclusions. The courtroom echoed with palpable tension as the verdict neared. Robert held his breath, his mind a murky mixture of hope and fear. Each word pronounced by the jurors was like a sentence that could seal their fate. Finally, the verdict was announced. In the case of the state versus Robert Turner, the jury considers the defendant not guilty. A collective sigh of relief spread across the room. Robert felt a huge weight being lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Collins, whose face displayed a subtle smile of triumph mixed with professionalism. "You did it, Robert," Collins said in a voice hoarse with restrained emotion. "You are free." Robert could hardly believe it. He looked around the room, processing the reality of his innocence being recognized by the law. Every moment in prison, every doubt and fear, now dissipated in the face of the jury's decision. As he left the courtroom, Robert felt renewed, a man finally freed from the burden of unjust accusations. He knew that he would still have to rebuild his life and overcome the traumas he had experienced, but at that moment, the sense of restored justice was the light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. He thanked Collins, his tireless defender, and looked up at the blue sky above, feeling grateful for a second chance that was now within his grasp. After the verdict that found him not guilty, Robert felt a mixture of relief and hope that his life could return to normal. He picked up the phone and called Mary, his wife in Phoenix, eager to share the good news and begin planning his return. "Mary, love, I have been cleared," Robert said in a voice trembling with emotion. "The jury decided in my favor. I'm free." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Mary answered. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tense and distant. "Robert, I'm happy for you, but we need to talk." Robert frowned, confused by Mary's reaction. "What do you mean? Why is it like this?" "You said you only went out for a walk that night," Mary began, her voice heavy with uncertainty. Robert felt a chill run down his spine as he tried to process what Mary was insinuating. "Mary, I always go for a walk, every night for a long time. I swear I don't know what you're talking about. I was acquitted. That should mean something, right?" Mary's voice grew firmer, though tinged with pain. "I saw the news, Robert. I love you, but we need to be honest with each other. Where were you really that night?" Mary's question echoed in Robert's mind like distant thunder. He sat, stunned by the reality that the innocence proclaimed by the court was not enough to erase the doubts and mistrust that had crept into his marriage. "Mary, please, you know I never will," began Robert. But his words were cut off by the pain and uncertainty that permeated the conversation. Mary's words pierced Robert's heart like sharp blades. He tried to explain, desperate to rebuild the trust that was crumbling between them. "I swear I did nothing wrong, Mary. I can't stand it alone. We need to support each other." There was another heavy silence on the other end of the line before Mary finally said in a firm voice, "I don't know, Robert. I don't know if I can." What followed was a litmus test for Robert and Mary, a moment when the truth must be confronted, not only in relation to the legal case he faced, but also in relation to the foundations of trust and commitment that underpinned their marriage. After the verdict that found him not guilty, Robert hoped that his life would return to normal, but reality turned out to be unforgiving. The innocence proclaimed by the court could not dispel the dark clouds of mistrust and suspicion that hung over him. In the neighborhood, people murmured and cast charged glances as he passed. Former friends avoided eye contact, and some even returned their greetings. Robert could feel the weight of the silent trial around him, as if the acquittal wasn't enough to wash away the stain that now marked his name. Robert felt a deep and lonely pain that surrounded him. He never imagined that the legal victory could leave him so empty. As he hung up the phone, he realized that even though he was acquitted, he remained a man accused, not only by the neighborhood and society, but also by those who once promised to be by his side, in health and illness. The not guilty verdict should have been a relief to Robert. Instead, it unleashed a storm of hatred and violence he never imagined. The news quickly spread through the neighborhood, and soon the latent hostility turned into a wave of uncontrollable anger against him. One night, a week after the trial, Robert was surprised by an angry crowd that had gathered in front of his house. Shouts of accusation echoed through the air. Faces distorted by anger approached him, hands raised in clenched fists. "Murderer! Monster!" shouted someone from the crowd, while others pushed and tried to break into Robert's house. He tried to close the door, but it was useless. The crowd was determined and violent. Robert was dragged outside, struck by angry fists and kicked as he fell to the ground. He heard insults and accusations being shouted around him, the fury of the uncontrolled population. Among the attackers were the relatives of the dead girl, faces distorted by grief and the search for revenge. They didn't want justice, they wanted blood. Robert tried to defend himself, begged for mercy, but his words were drowned out by blows. He felt each punch as punishment not only for a crime he did not commit, but for being the scapegoat of a community consumed by pain and a thirst for unreached justice. The violence continued until Robert lost consciousness. His vision blurred. His mind spun in a whirlpool of physical and emotional pain. He was left on the ground, unconscious and bloodied, as the crowd dispersed, leaving behind the trail of destruction they had inflicted. Hours later, Robert was found by police and rushed to hospital. He was in critical condition, in an induced coma to protect his body from the severe damage he had suffered. In the intensive care unit, as Robert struggled between life and death, the tragedy of his situation echoed in the minds of many who witnessed or heard of the brutal lynching he had faced. Justice, which had acquitted him, now seemed a mere formality in the face of the brutality of popular revenge that had left him on the verge of death. Robert's battle for survival became a struggle not only against his physical injuries, but also against the deep and invisible wounds of a community that had become judge, jury, and executioner in their own quest for justice. When Robert finally emerged from the coma, consciousness brought with it a harsh reality. He opened his eyes to the white ceiling of the hospital, the distant sounds of machines, and the familiar smell of antiseptics. His mind, however, was clouded with painkillers, and the physical impact of the lynching still echoed in every fiber of his being, and he no longer had the movement of his legs. In the assaults, he had broken some vertebrae and was thus confined to a wheelchair. After weeks of intensive treatment, Robert was discharged from the hospital. He was moved home, but it was no longer the cozy home he knew. Now it was a place transformed by tragedy, by the painful memories that crept into every dark corner. The house was silent when he arrived. The walls that once welcomed him now seemed mute witnesses to his misfortune. Robert found himself alone, facing the reality that his life had changed forever. He looked around the living room, seeing the untidy furniture and personal belongings that now had an air of abandonment. The wheelchair, a tangible symbol of his new reality, was there, waiting for him. With a painful effort, Robert transferred to the wheelchair. He felt a mixture of helplessness and anger as he moved through the house, now a maze of physical challenges he had never imagined facing. From that moment, the days dragged on, each marked by monotony and loneliness. Robert tried to maintain a routine, but it was difficult to find meaning in his daily activities. The memory of the screams of the crowd and the hands that assaulted him continued to haunt him, as if he could not escape from the past even in his own home. His ex-wife, Mary, had filed for divorce, and Robert found himself completely alone facing that harsh new reality. The house closed completely. Robert spent his days inside it, wandering in his chair, the curtains drawn and the doors completely locked. Visits from social workers and doctors were the only points of contact with the outside world. They offered words of encouragement and promises of rehabilitation, but for Robert, each attempt at recovery seemed like an insurmountable mountain. In the evening, he sat before the window, looking at the deserted street beyond. Time passed, marked by the insistent ticking of the clock on the wall. He wondered if he would ever be able to regain not only the movement of his legs, but also the sense of belonging and dignity he had lost. Robert now lived in a world of painful memories and an uncertain future. He was a man scarred by what had happened, a victim not only of physical violence but also of social injustice and human cruelty that had made him a stranger in his own home. Over the years that followed the horrific incident that changed his life, Robert found himself trapped in a monotonous cycle of loneliness and daily struggle. His home, once full of life and comfort, was now a lonely refuge where he spent his days. Mornings began with the meticulous routine of taking care of yourself in the wheelchair, each movement a constant reminder of your limitations. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, with no clear purpose other than to survive day after day. He had never heard from his ex-wife and their children, who seemed to have completely abandoned him. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now filled with heavy silences. However, one day, something changed. A gentle knock on the door brought with it the presence of Father Peter, a man of faith and compassion who had decided to pay Robert a visit. He brought with him an aura of serenity and a gentle voice that echoed through the empty walls of the house. "Robert, I heard about your story and I came here to offer my support," Father Peter said with a warm smile as Robert invited him in. As the days passed, Father Peter became a regular presence in Robert's life. They spent hours talking about life, faith, and human nature. The priest read passages from the Bible to Robert, sharing stories of courage and perseverance that echoed deeply with his own journey. One of the passages that most resonated with Robert was the story of Job, a man who faced countless trials, losing everything he had, but keeping his faith unshakable. Robert saw parallels between his own situation and the tribulations Job faced, finding comfort in the idea that even in the worst of circumstances, there was still room for hope and redemption. Father Peter not only shared religious teachings, but also offered a friendly shoulder and a listening ear to Robert's emotional struggles. He brought a light of compassion and understanding into Robert's life, helping him find meaning and purpose even in the midst of suffering and loneliness. Father Peter's visits not only filled his time, but also restored his faith in humanity and the possibility of a more promising future, despite the adversities he faced. One afternoon, Father Peter arranged for Robert to leave the house. "How's it been since we last saw each other, Robert?" "It's not always easy, Father. Sometimes I feel suffocated by everything that has happened. How can I move forward when so many judge me without understanding?" "Believe me, Robert, I understand your pain. But remember that true strength comes from our ability to face adversity with dignity. You are not only being judged by others, but by what is in your heart. Sometimes it's hard to keep the faith, Father. Why did this happen to me?" This is a question that many of us ask ourselves in the face of difficult times. Remember that the answers are not always clear, but God gives us the strength to keep going, even when we don't understand why. "I try, but sometimes I feel like I'm adrift, lost in a sea of uncertainty." The journey of faith is not a straight road, Robert. It's a winding road, with ups and downs. But in time, I hope you will find peace and comfort in God's love. Sometimes life puts us on paths we never imagined walking. But even in the darkest moments, there is beauty and hope to be found. I had never noticed how flowers look more alive in sunlight. It's like each petal tells a story. Just like each of us, Robert, we are shaped by our experiences, but we also have the power to flourish again despite adversity. I think I'm starting to understand. The journey of faith is about finding meaning even in the darkness. Exactly, my friend. And I am here to walk beside you, sharing this journey of discovery and redemption. Father Peter's visits were an unexpected ray of light in the darkness that enveloped Robert. He brought with him a serenity that filled the emptiness of the house. Sitting in the living room on a sunny afternoon, the priest shared words of faith and hope, while Robert listened intently, trying to make sense of what had happened to him. "Robert, tell me how you feel about those who have doubted you," said the priest, with a compassionate expression. Robert looked out the window for a moment, gathering the courage to express his feelings. "It's hard, Father Peter. Sometimes I feel a mixture of sadness and anger. They condemned me without understanding the truth. How can I forgive them for that?" The priest nodded understandingly. "Forgiveness is a process, my friend. It begins with accepting one's own pain and understanding the pain of others. Sometimes forgiveness means releasing yourself from the weight of the past." Robert took a deep breath, absorbing the priest's words. "I want to forgive, Father, but it seems so difficult to leave behind everything that happened." Father Peter put his hand gently on Robert's shoulder. "To forgive is not to forget, Robert. It means choosing not to let bitterness rule your life. It begins with forgiving yourself for having resisted injustice." Robert felt a lump in his throat, fighting back tears that threatened to escape. "I want to find that way, Father. I want to move on and find peace." 2 decades had passed since Father Peter entered Robert's life, bringing with him not only words of comfort and faith, but also a friendship that stood the test of time. Throughout these years, Robert found a path of redemption and acceptance, guided by the shared lessons and the constant presence of the priest. But fate is often cruel, and one day Robert received the painful news that Father Peter had passed away. The death of the only true friend he had known in decades was a devastating blow. Robert, now older and still facing the limitations of his wheelchair, felt a deep void open up inside him. On the day of burial, Robert went to the church where he had so often found solace and spiritual guidance. After his prayers, he went to the cemetery, arrived early, while the first rays of the morning sun illuminated the tombstones. The atmosphere was charged with sadness and longing, reflecting the loss of a man whose kindness had touched her life. During the ceremony, Robert looked around and noticed something that perplexed him. There was hardly anyone there, no familiar face other than the members of the congregation and a few close friends. He then learned that the priest had been frowned upon when he began to get involved with Robert. Robert couldn't contain his excitement. After the service, as the mourners dispersed, Robert stood near the newly dug grave, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He thought about the loneliness that Peter must have felt in his later years, the same feelings of isolation that Robert knew so well, and that the priest had chosen that simply to not leave him alone. He had been a great man. "Father Peter," Robert muttered to himself as he looked at the tombstone, "you were my friend when everyone else abandoned me. I'm sorry I didn't know you also faced loneliness." As silent tears flowed down his aging face, Robert made a silent promise to his deceased friend. He would carry with him not only the memories of Father Peter's words and lessons, but also the commitment to honor his memory by sharing his story and always seeking to be to others what the priest was to him. A beacon of hope and compassion in times of darkness, even if he himself had to face searing loneliness. After the burial of Father Peter, Robert felt a change within himself. The loss of his friend was a painful reminder of the passage of time and the ephemerality of life. However, instead of letting himself be consumed by loneliness and sadness, he found a new perspective. In the years that followed, Robert began to live more lightly. He found comfort in writing, turning his experiences and reflections into letters and small notes. They were like essays on the unsettling human condition that he used to write every day. Writing has become not only a means of expression, but also a way to connect with the outside world, even if indirectly. Each written word was an attempt to share his own pains and learnings, and he kept them in a crate under his bed. Robert continued to live in his home, surrounded by the memories of a tragic life lived intensely. He found solace in the quiet routine and small joys of everyday life. His days were filled with writing, reading books that Father Peter had recommended to him, and also with imaginary conversations with his deceased friend. But at the end of his journey, when time called him to say goodbye to this life, Robert quietly left. On the day of his burial, the small cemetery was empty except for funeral services and cemetery staff. There were no relatives or close friends to pay their last respects. And so, Robert was buried in a simple grave, marked only by his name and the dates of his birth and death. His story, his letters and notes, the house was locked left of inheritance to his children who did not want to even approach that place. A few years have passed since Robert's death. The abandoned house has gathered dust and sadness, remaining there as a proof of the tragedy that 30 years ago had befallen and touched the whole city. But everything changed when in the small office of the police station, Detective Smith listened attentively to the testimony of the witness. It was an elderly man, with deep wrinkles marking his face, and his eyes reflected a mixture of guilt and relief that he was finally sharing the truth he had held for so long. "Detective, I know it's hard to believe after so many years, but I need to tell you what I know," the man began in a trembling voice. My son was involved in that terrible incident 30 years ago. He told me what he did to the poor girl, and how he created that false evidence to frame Robert." Detective Smith arched his eyebrows, intensely focused on the man's words. "Go on, please. What exactly did your child do?" The witness took a deep breath before continuing, as if every word weighed on him. He said he saw Robert on the street that night. My son was scared, confused. He was only 13 years old at the time. He lied to the police, said that he saw Robert near the girl's house. Then he helped create false evidence to corroborate the lie. The detective took meticulous notes as the witness revealed crucial details that completely changed the perspective of the case that had haunted the city for decades. "I know there's no undoing what happened, Detective," the man continued with a heavy sigh. "But I couldn't live with that weight anymore. Robert has had his life unfairly ruined by something he never did. Even though I was acquitted, which I was very happy about at the time, I thought everything would end well, but things got worse and I never had the courage to tell and condemn my own son. But he died some time ago and I felt like I needed to tell someone about it." Detective Smith nodded, realizing the magnitude of the revelations being made. He knew he needed to act quickly to right an injustice that had endured for so long. "Thank you for coming to us, sir," said the detective, with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Your information is crucial. We will investigate every detail and bring justice to Robert, even if posthumously." The witness nodded with mixed sadness and relief. He knew that at last the truth was coming out, bringing a belated hope of redemption to a man who had borne an unjust burden until his death. As the testimony ended and the detective continued his investigations, the town began to wake up to the shocking twist in Robert's case. Years after his solitary death and eternal wheelchair-bound sentence, the truth was emerging, shedding light on a story of injustice and the devastating consequences of a mistake that cost decades of life and reputation. And so, justice began to move, not for Robert personally, but for his memory and for those who still believed in his innocence. Robert's story, marred by tragedy and loneliness, found a new chapter of hope and redemption, even if it was too late for those who knew him and suffered with him. The Lord, without bearing the weight of confession, was found dead days later, with his neck hanging from a rope. The impact of the witness' confession reverberated throughout the city, casting a shadow of disbelief and anguish over those who had so long believed in Robert's guilt. The revelation of the lies and falsification of evidence shook the foundations of the community, confronting it with the harsh reality of an injustice perpetuated for decades. For many, the weight of guilt was almost unbearable. Those who were directly or indirectly involved in the case, and the lynching, felt deeply ashamed and remorseful. Mary had already died many years ago, never having forgiven or believed her ex-husband. Mary's children, who had taken their father's name from the documents, now adults and with lives shaped by the shadow of the past, received the news with an overwhelming mixture of emotions. The tears they shed were not only for Robert, but also for all the lives that were affected by the lies and the devastating consequences that followed. They wept copiously for their father, not knowing how to act in the face of it. There was nothing more to be done. Gathering courage, they decided to face the past. With heavy hearts, but determined to do what was right, they headed to the place where Robert had been buried, a man whose innocence had finally been recognized. Under the gray sky of the cemetery, they knelt before the simple grave and allowed themselves to be carried away by the emotions that overflowed. "Robert," they whispered in unison, their voices choked with pain and remorse. "We didn't know, Father. We didn't know we were wrong. Forgive us." His words, charged with genuine repentance, echoed among the silent tombstones. It was a moment of recognition of the truth and a request for posthumous forgiveness that sought to soften, in some way, the weight of injustice that his father carried until the end of his lonely days. David and his brothers, who had never visited the city again, let alone their father's house since they moved there, decided to finally face the past. The house had been closed and untouched since Robert's death, a silent monument to tragedy. As they walked through the door, a wave of nostalgia and sadness enveloped them. The air was heavy with the dust of abandonment and the memories of better days. Exploring the house, they discovered a box hidden in Robert's bedroom, under his bed. Inside, They found old documents, family photos, and one last letter from her father. With trembling hands, David read the letter aloud for all to hear, each word a blow to the heart. My beloved children, if you are reading this letter, it is because at last the truth has come to light. I forgive them for going on with their lives without me. I love them and always will. May you find peace and justice in this world. When they finished, they couldn't hold back their tears. The embrace they shared at that moment was a symbol of redemption and forgiveness, a promise that in spite of everything, love and truth would prevail. The truth and memory of Robert remained alive in the pages he wrote, in the hearts of those who were once touched by his words. He had found peace in the knowledge that, despite the loneliness at the end, his life had meaning, and his legacy would continue to inspire others, just as Father Peter had inspired him. And so Robert's story and his journey of redemption and forgiveness found its end, not in the silence of the grave, but in the eternity of the stories shared and the lessons learned by all involved in this tragedy. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.